So, just a quick clarification, this video is talking about the most overhated Spongebob episodes by the general fan consensus. How I've defined this is that the episodes that get the most undeserved hate end up higher on the list. So with that said, Oral Report. It's an episode that some people do consider to be good, but I seem to hear a lot more opinions about this episode being negative, thus its inclusion on the list. I mean, I can sort of see why Patrick's treatment of SpongeBob can give the episode a more uncomfortable tone, but to me, that rapid-fire sequence of Patrick is one of the better sequences in the episode. Not in just the episode, though, but in Season 8 as a whole. Now, yeah, the episode does have its problems, and I don't like every episode on this list, this one included, but I do think Oral Report does get too much hate, to the point that it's undeserving. The only real positive opinion I've seen on this is when Pie Guy gave it a good, so there are at least a few people that see some positives in this episode. Outside of the Patrick scenes, this kind of isn't very engaging though, and I feel like this episode's best aspect is the one that gets hated on the most, which is a bit unfair in my opinion. But it's only number 5 because at the end of the day, the hate hinges on one scene. So whether you like the scene of Patrick's rock of him preparing SpongeBob to give this big presentation, that's going to influence your opinion on the episode very much. And because that one part of the episode is where most of the opinions hinge, it comes down to taste at the end of the day. I'll be honest, the basic genre of SpongeBob episodes where Squidward just gets harmed the entire episode is one that gets a lot of hate, and rightfully so. And yes, there's been times where that's worked, and there have also been many times where it hasn't worked. But for some reason, among the pantheon of the worst Squidward episodes, sometimes I hear Squidtastic Voyage get mentioned, which to me, putting this episode up there with Choir Boys and Squid's Visit isn't fair. The main thing that separates this SpongeBob episode from those, to me, is the fact that SpongeBob and Patrick aren't really out of character here. They're stupid as usual, but at least they're still attempting to help Squidward get his clarinet reed out of his throat. They're just not good at that, and so that's where the attempts at comedy come from. I'm not a huge fan of this one, but I also don't think it's terrible either. This still feels like a SpongeBob episode, which is something I can't really say about episodes like Boating Buddies or Pineapple Fever. There were some nice jokes, even if the bulk of them boil down to Patrick misunderstanding something making the problem worse. And I also like how the end of the episode with the conflict resolution ties back to the opening scene. It makes it feel like an actual fleshed out story. So yeah, not a good episode, but it's certainly not one of the worst Squidward episodes, not by a long shot. I get the argument of why most people think SpongeBob doesn't do gross-out episodes very well. I mean, Fungus Among Us is probably a bottom 10 episode in Season 5, but there is another gross-out episode in Season 7 that people seem to dislike, and in my opinion, they dislike it unjustly. I'm of course talking about Greasy Buffoons. Greasy Buffoons is really the first episode on this list that I actually think is good. It's at least in the top half of the show in my opinion. While the grease can be disgusting on your first or second watch through, I often come back to just how funny some of the moments in the episode can be. The arms race near the climax of the episode is probably the best part, as well as seeing the customers basically just eat straight up grease. Also, the joke where Squidward just vanishes after being asked a favor by Mr. Krabs is really funny, showing that there are at least a few good moments in episodes in Season 7. I can understand why this episode gets hate, but even with that, in my opinion, it's too much. With this entry, I'm kind of blurring the line on what's considered a hated episode, but when the conversation of worst episodes in the classic seasons comes up, the paper is often a topic of conversation. And I can't really understand why. I mean, even during production, this episode had a lot stacked against it. Since it was paired in the time slot with the Valentine's Day episode, it meant people only really got to see this episode once a year, unless they watched it on DVD or iTunes. It also has kind of a drab setting, not really taking place outside of SpongeBob and Squidward's front yard, which can turn some people off, and also, it's in the first season. That's generally considered to be the worst of the 3 classic seasons. That drab setting, though, in my opinion, works in this episode's favor, since the whole point of the episode is that SpongeBob is able to do all these cool things with just a piece of paper, causing Squidward to trade everything he owns just to get it. That alone is what makes this episode really funny. That, SpongeBob's obliviousness, and Gary playing Squidward's clarinet. When I first watched this episode, I laughed the hardest I ever have when watching an episode of SpongeBob. and this is one of the episodes that people consider to be very dull. I'm not seeing what you guys are, apparently. Now, before we talk about the actual episode, no, this is not a good episode. It's a very bad one. But I think people get a bit dramatic when talking about how bad this episode is.
To be blunt, this episode is so bad, I think they should have straight up stopped using Mrs. Puff after this one.
Mrs. Puff, who you'd think would be the sympathetic character, gets rid of that sympathy by trying to actually get Spongebob killed. And my question is, okay, I understand the hate, but why isn't Out of the Picture just as hated, if not more? In Out of the Picture, there's even less justification because Squidward didn't permanently deform Mr. Krabs. But in Demolition Doofus, Mrs. Puff is at least a bit more understandable in why she's doing this. But in the lens of comparison to Out of the Picture, these episodes are more similar than you'd think, while the reactions to them are very different. If you think an episode about one character trying to kill another character isn't a good idea for a children's cartoon, fine, we agree. But don't turn around and then not keep that same attitude when another episode executes that plotline in a worse way. Now, when you say, well, why didn't you put Out of the Picture in your overrated list if you're going to talk about it in your Demolition Doofus entry? The reason is because I don't really like that, and in all fairness, most people don't really consider it to be that good. But it's treated very differently despite its similarity, thus Demolition Doofus's placement at number 1.